You don't have to be a New Testament scholar. You don't have to know any of the ancient languages. You hardly have to do more than just a cursory reading through the book First John to realize that the theme, the dominating primary theme of John's letter is love. Now, that leans up against an idea in the culture where he lived and where the original recipients of this letter lived, the idea of Gnosticism. We talked about that. I'm going to just set it aside for now and say, we've been going down the trail of love, and it's an inexhaustible subject. And yet we got to come back to it. John, in 1 John 4:16, and so we know and rely on the love God has for us. Then he goes on, God is love. We talked about it and picked it apart and poked into it and tried to go as far down the trail as time would permit. I don't know that we'd ever get to the end of the trail on it, but God is love. This is the essence of his nature. If you could only grab one thing about God and cling to it, I would want it to be God's love. Is he just? Yes. Is he merciful? Yes. But love is the golden ring, right? And then, now, this is where God's love, a peculiar, particular kind of love, agape, kind of, it connects with, or I should say, our lives have to connect with God's love. And this is what John says, his next breath. Whoever lives in love lives in God, and God in them. As though to say, okay, now if you want to know, are you living in God? Is God living in you? And we talked about that before. Well, here's a way to know. If you live in love. Now, that's pretty tall order. If you live in love, then whoever lives in love lives in God, and God in them. That's pretty big stuff. How do you live in love? Well, does it mean you only do behaviors of love? I don't know how it could mean that. I mean, we're talking about human beings, flawed, limited, inadequate, not always loving. We don't always feel loving. We don't always act loving. So how does one live in love? Well, a fish lives in water. I live in oxygen and air and the atmosphere around me, and I live. This is my environment. I want love to be my environment. I want it to, in a real similar way, as love is the marking characteristic, the deepest component of God's nature. I want love to be the marking characteristic, the deepest mark of my nature as well. To live in love, if you were a young adolescent, you might think, man, I'm just going to be in love all my life. That's not exactly what we're talking about. To live in love, not the same thing as to be in love. Think about just one little slice. If you're married, then, and if you've been married more than, I'm going to say a year, by the second year, a lot of couples are no longer living on love. right? I do remember vividly. I hope I never forget how the the enthusiasm. I mean, just the yeah boy of being in love with my wife in at the beginning, and even after we got married. But I also remember a really weird thing happened to me after we got married, leading up to us being married. I was a hopeless romantic. I wrote love poems that are, I'm so grateful they haven't survived, because they were just sloppy. Um, I couldn't get her off my mind. She was my constant distraction, and I was like, I mean, we were the couple you would go, come on, come on. That was us. But once we got married, it's like somebody turned the switch off. I didn't write any more poems, hardly ever. Oh gosh, I remember our first Valentine's Day after we married. It was awful. I totally forgot that it was Valentine's Day. We had to get up early to get to an early class, about a half hour drive to school, and I mentioned, I think I mentioned about 40, 11 times, I am way not a morning person, never have been. Well, I stumbled into our little breakfast nook in our one bedroom apartment, which, by the way, when we first moved in, seemed like a palace compared with the dormitory that we both lived in. Anyway, I stumbled in, and she had a card and a wonderful breakfast prepared, and it was like, oops, what's this about? I mean, that's how dull I had become. Ooh, that was the first and only time I managed to forget Valentine's Day. She didn't go into a rage. She didn't, but boy, was she ever hurt. Okay. Uh, I don't know what happened. Well, no, wait, I have to back up. I do know what happened. I'm a selfish pig. And if it doesn't relate to me, I don't think about it. And I have spent, golly, the last almost 50, well, at least 50 years, probably more than 50, but at least 50 years trying to mitigate that aspect of myself. And it's a part of me I don't like. But boy, was it there in evidence on that first Valentine's Day. Well, I think living in love and being in love are connected, but boy, they're way not the same thing. And by the way, this kind of love that John points to here is not romantic love. It's not even familial love. It's not friendship love. It's the unique, we've talked about it before, agape love of God that says, I just love. To live in that, for that to be the oxygen I breathe, for that to be the water I swim in as a fish, that needs to be the essence of my life. I live in love. Whoever lives in love lives in God. So, do I live in love so that I will live in God? Or could, I think this is more the case. My life gives evidence. It shows itself by me living in love. That demonstrates that I'm living in God. I have noticed this. The more I am able to open my life up to God, the more consistently and capably I love. There's one primary thing that keeps me from opening myself up to God and His word, his ways, his nature, his work in my life. The one primary thing is me. I so get in my own way. Do you? Do you get in your way on this? I cling to what, for some, and I look at this, when I try to look at this objectively, it's just a stupid reason. But the reason is I cling to mine. I want my life. I want control. I want to be in charge. And for me to have more of God, for God to have more of me is really what it comes down to. I can't get any more of God, but God can always have more of me. And yet there's this, it's kind of a weird deal here. God already has all of me, whether now I can more or less willingly give myself to him. I guess that's what I'm talking about. How do I more willingly give more of my will, my heart, my soul, my mind, my strength to him? See, there's a direct connect here. When Jesus was asked, and we've talked about this before, but you got to come back to it all the time. When Jesus was asked, what is the greatest of the commands? His response was, remember, from Deuteronomy chapter 6, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second, he said, is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Okay, is there any aspect of me that is left out in that 4-word expression, explanation, boundary markers? That's all of me. Now, it doesn't say from my heart, from my soul, from my mind, and from my strength. It's with all my. Oh, there's no switch to flip. You don't get there quickly. This is a lifetime endeavor. It's a very popular phrase. One should desire to be a lifelong learner. It's legitimate. I want to be a lifelong learner. And the main thing I want to learn for all my life is, how do I love God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength? Because as I grow in that, it becomes more natural, more easy. I become more effective at loving my neighbor as myself. John writes, whoever lives in love lives in God and God in them. There is this symbiotic relationship that God lives in us and we live in him. We live in him, he lives in us. And what would be the point of God living in me? For me to be happy? For me to feel good and special? I don't think that's a point. I think those are they're way down the line in why they matter. Well, what's the point? I don't know the whole thing, but I do know this much. When I live in love, I live in God, and God lives in me. And what then becomes possible is that I relate to life more and more and more on the basis of his nature, his ways, not mine. Well, there's a whole bunch of things that doesn't matter and a whole bunch of things that it does matter to. Briefly, one of the things that doesn't happen when I live in love, living in him, and he lives in me, is that my life doesn't get wonderful. It can still be pretty cruddy. But even in the crud, even in the difficulties, even in the adversities, I really still can live in love and live in God, and he live in me. We'll talk some more about this next time on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.